The Murder of Tutankhamun, A True Story by Bob Breyer. Chapter 1. The King Must Die. We possess a remarkable amount of evidence about Tutankhamun, enough to recreate what his last days may have been like. So let's start with a fictional account, but one that is probably very close to the truth. Sometime in late autumn, during the 18th year of his life, Tutankhamun went to bed alone. Although peasant husbands and wives slept in the same room, Egyptian pharaohs lived in separate palaces from those of their queen and ladies of the harem. Conjugal visits were one thing, sleep was another. Tutankhamun reposed in a large room, sparsely furnished, a few stools, tables, and a single wood bed with feet shaped like lions' paws. Fish, duck, and marsh grasses painted on the room's plastered walls glowed spectrally in the dim light. In the depth of this night, the door silently opened, just wide enough for a single man to creep through before closing it behind him. Somehow he had slipped past the sentries. Had they been told to look the other way? Stealthily, the night intruder made his way to Pharaoh's bed, the sound of his feet perhaps obscured by the drip, drip of a water clock. He found the king sleeping on his side, his head supported by an alabaster headrest. From under his clothes, the man drew out a heavy object, possibly an Egyptian mace, that joined a solid 3-inch stone to the end of a substantial 2-foot stick. After a single deep breath, he swung the heavy object at Tutankhamun's skull. Waiting just a moment for the sudden sound in the night to be forgotten, the intruder retraced his steps through the royal bedchamber, out the door, and stole through the palace to the safety of night. The next morning, servants discovered the unconscious but not yet dead pharaoh and quickly summoned the vizier, and Tutankhamun's wife, Akhenaten. A priest-physician skilled in head injuries was ordered from the temple. The physician had seen many trauma injuries. Blocks of stone sometimes fell on workmen during construction. Infantrymen received blows to the head. But this was the pharaoh. The physician must have been very careful what he said or did. He instructed his assistant to shave Pharaoh's head so a proper diagnosis could be made. As the bronze blade removed the fine dark hair, the surgeon was already thinking about the consequences of treatment, both for the pharaoh and for his own career. If he took decisive action and Tutankhamun died, he could be blamed. Now the head was shaved, revealing one wound, a large, warm, swollen mass. It was in an unusual place for such an injury, at the back of the head, where the neck joins the skull. The great surgical papyrus did not describe how to treat such an injury. The blow had caused unconsciousness, but only a slight fracture to the skull. There were no bone fragments that must be removed. Relieved, the surgeon replaces his bronze probe and tweezers in their wooden case. Still, blood is oozing from the pharaoh's nostrils, a sign that the meninges, the skin enclosing the brain, has been damaged. I, the prime minister, stand silently next to the bed, calm, weighing what the pharaoh's death will mean to Egypt and himself. Akhenaten, frightened, looks to the physician for his prognosis. He's been trained to give one of 3 responses. Number 1, this is an ailment which I will treat. 2, this is an ailment with which I will contend. And 3, this is an ailment not to be treated. If he says the ailment can be treated, he implies that the treatment will be successful. If he instead says he will merely contend with it, he implies an uncertain outcome. The physician quickly evaluates the situation. With no splinters to remove, no bones to set, there was little he could do physically for the king. To say that he will treat the ailment asserts that the king will survive, and of this he is not sure. Should Tutankhamun die, the physician will be blamed. There are only two real alternatives, and given the importance of the patient, it is safer to say that this is an illness not to be treated. Better to hand the fate of the king over to the gods. The predicament faced by this priest-physician was no different from modern physicians called to treat a famous patient. Doctors in emergency rooms around the world have observed and named it the famous patient syndrome. When confronted with a famous patient, medical personnel are afraid to act quickly, to do instinctively what they've been trained to do. Junior staff members defer to senior staff members. Discussions take place before actions are taken. Tutankhamun was probably not the first ruler to suffer the consequences of his exalted position, and he was certainly not the last. Abraham Lincoln may have died because of his fame. After the president was shot in the head, the young surgeon attending him at Ford's Theater did everything right. He examined the hole entry with his finger, determined there was no exit hole, and let the president rest. Then the Surgeon General was summoned, while President Lincoln was removed to a nearby boarding house. The Surgeon General was a bureaucrat who had not treated a patient for years, but he immediately took control of Lincoln's treatment. He inserted a probe into the entry hole and slid it in, almost up to Lincoln's eyes. The Surgeon General did not know that the last medical wisdom taught in medical schools was not to probe. The brain is so soft, you can't tell if you're following the path of the bullet or causing additional damage. Recent reevaluation of the case suggests that Lincoln might have survived with the bullet lodged in his brain. He was a victim of famous patient syndrome. So the surgeon priest turned to Akhenaten and spoke the very words she feared. This is an ailment not to be treated. As Akhenaten sobbed, the surgeon's assistant was instructed to clear the king's nostrils of blood. The pharaoh breathed more easily now, lying peacefully on his low bed. Magician healers would be called to assist the king. By afternoon, the healers had gathered the ingredients for their poultice. Equal parts of berry of coriander, berry of the poppy plant, wormwood, berry of the sames plant, berry of the juniper plant. Mixed with honey, it formed a paste that they spread on the wound and covered with a square of finely woven linen on which had been drawn the Eye of Horus symbol. Horus the falcon god had lost his eye in the battle with Seth, but it was magically regenerated by Thoth, god of magic. The markings around a falcon's eye became a sign for healing. For the first few days, there was optimism. Tutankhamun briefly regained consciousness and was able to eat. Akhenaten brought him chopped figs mixed with eggs because eggs had regenerative properties. The magician healer placed flour of egg, powdered eggshells, in Tutankhamun's wine so the damaged skull would knit smooth like an eggshell. Yet as days became weeks, the pharaoh, drifting in and out of consciousness, weakened. His vision blurred and the pain in his head became almost unbearable, as if something were pressing on every part of his skull. To dull the pain, Akhenaten brought more and more of his favorite wine, made from grapes from his own vineyards. When winter came, Tutankhamun lapsed into final unconsciousness and could receive tiny amounts of wine through a straw, only with difficulty. The wailing started with Akhenaten, who was with Tutankhamun when he died, spread through the female servants in the palace and across the river to Thebes, uniting rich and poor in the primal ritual mourning cry that told Osiris, god of the dead, to expect another Westerner. Within a few hours of the shock, I began the plans to prepare Tutankhamun's burial. Our account above of Tutankhamun's death is fiction, but is based on evidence that has survived 3,300 years since his death. We are in an even better position to reconstruct his burial. The tomb of Tutankhamun has been prepared for himself next to his grandfather's in the western spur of the Valley of the Kings, was far short of completion when the boy king died. There was, however, a nearly complete tomb in the main valley that had not been used. Originally intended for a private person, a rare but not unprecedented honor, I decided to appropriate this tomb for his pharaoh. Artists commenced painting appropriate scenes on the walls immediately. There was no time to carve the scenes. As the tomb was being readied, embalmers prepared Tutankhamun's body for eternity. Mummification was primarily a physical process, but every stage of the embalming was accompanied by religious rituals. The most important step was to remove all moisture from the body as quickly as possible. Bacteria need moisture to destroy tissue. If there is no water, the body will not decay. Both the brain and the internal organs are extremely moist, so to avoid putrefaction, they had to be removed soon after death. When Tutankhamun's body was brought to the royal embalmers, it was placed on an alabaster mummification table, inclined so it was at work, so that as work proceeded on the body, the fluids would run off into a basin below. The brain was removed by inserting a long wire into the nostril, breaking through the ethmoid bone into the cranium. The wire was then rotated, used as a whisk, to break down the brain tissue into a semi-liquid state that would drain out through the nostrils when the body was turned upside down. The embalmers preserved almost every part of the body so Tutankhamun would be complete when he resurrected in the next world. However, they discarded the brain, unaware of its function. Egyptians believed that you thought with your heart, not your brain, since it is the heart that beats repeatedly when someone is excited, not the brain. In the Bible, when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let the Israelites go, we are told Pharaoh's heart was hardened. After Tutankhamun's brain was removed and discarded, an incision was made in the lower left side of his abdomen, so the internal organs could be reached. The stomach, liver, intestines, and kidneys were carefully removed and placed in shallow bowls. Later, the dissected organs were deposited in 4 miniature gold coffins in preparation for the day the king would resurrect in the next world. Only his heart was left in the body, so that he would be able to remember and recite the magical spells that would reanimate his corpse. Even after the brain and internal organs were removed, considerable moisture still remained locked in the body's soft tissues. To eliminate this, the embalmers covered Tutankhamun's body with natron, a naturally occurring compound of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and sodium chloride, basically baking soda and salt. After the body has rested for 35 days in natron, almost all its water had been leached out. The mummy now weighed less than 50 pounds and was ready for wrapping. As each bandage was applied, a priest wearing the mask of Anubis, the jackal, the god of embalming, read magical spells that would ensure Tutankhamun's preservation and resurrection. The priest placed more than 150 pieces of jewelry and magical amulets within the linen bandages to ensure the boy king's immortality. As the embalmers practiced their art, master craftsmen throughout the land worked to prepare his funerary goods. There were wooden shrines to be carved and gilded, a gold mask and coffins to be fashioned, furniture, linens, clothing, and jewelry to be assembled. Preparation of the Ushabti's figures alone were a major undertaking. These hundreds of little servant figurines were expected to magically come alive and serve Tutankhamun in the next world. Each one an individual sculpture in wood or stone carved in the likeness of Tutankhamun. The figures were mummiform in shape, the image of Osiris, the god of the dead. Because Egypt was an agrarian society, the work in the next world would be farming, so the Ushabtis held agricultural implements in their hands. Tutankhamun had 413 Ushabtis, 365 workers, one for each day of the year, 36 overseers, one for each gang of 10 workers, and an additional 12 monthly overseers. There must have been a panic in the workshops of Egypt as craftsmen worked in teams throughout the night to prepare for the burial of the pharaoh. Maya, the treasurer, commissioned a beautiful miniature wooden sculpture of Tutankhamun on a funerary couch, holding a tiny gold crook and flail, so the gods would know he was a great king. Along the side of the sculpture, an inscription proclaimed Maya's devotion to his young pharaoh. Made by the servant who is beneficial to his lord, doing what he says, who does not allow anything to go wrong, whose face is cheerful when he does it with a loving heart as a thing profitable to his lord. At some point in the preparation of Tutankhamen's funerary goods, time ran out. The 70 days had elapsed. The embalmer's work and all the coffins were complete, but other ritual objects simply couldn't be finished on time. So the tomb of Tutankhamen's brother, Smenkhare, was opened, and the miniature coffins that held his internal organs were reused for Tutankhamun. Inside each coffin, inscribed in gold, is a prayer from the Book of the Dead, a collection of about 200 spells, incantations, prayers, and hymns. The prayers inside refer to Tutankhamun, but beneath his cartouche are traces of the name Smenkhare, his brother. 70 days after Tutankhamun's death, the funeral procession gathered on the west bank of Thebes to conduct his mummy to its house of eternity. The body was placed on a sled, and a wooden shrine draped with garland was placed over it. Across the top of the shrine, 2 rows of beautifully carved and painted wooden cobras reared up to protect Tutankhamun on his journey to the underworld. The sled was pulled by the palace officials. Pentu and Usermat, the ministers of Upper and Lower Egypt, wore the distinctive robes of their office and were joined by 10 other officials, all wearing white mourning bands around their heads. As the procession slowly made its way over the barren land toward the Valley of the Kings, the women wailed, tore their garments, and threw sand on their head in the traditional gestures of mourning. Among them, but feeling very alone, was Ankhus and Amun. When pallbearers reached the tomb, the procession paused. In the course of wrapping the mummy, Tutankhamun's mouth and nose had been covered. Now, before he entered the tomb for eternity, a ceremony was performed to magically open his mouth so Tutankhamun would be able to breathe and say the magical spells of the Book of the Dead. The pallbearers, joined by the priest and members of the funeral procession, performed the opening of the mouth ceremony for Tutankhamun. More a mystery play than a religious ritual, a dozen participants were required for the performance. The officiating priest held a papyrus describing how things should proceed. A small group of the officials played roles of the guards of Horus, who would help Tutankhamun be resurrected like Osiris in the next world. The area in front of the tomb where the play was to be performed was purified with water from 4 different vases, each representing one of the 4 corners of the earth. 4 burners holding incense were lit, and various gods were invoked. A ritual slaughter was performed, commemorating the battle in which Horus avenged Osiris's death. In the myth, Seth's conspirators, after dismembering Osiris's corpse, attempted to escape Horus by changing into various animals, but Horus caught them and cut off their heads. Thus, at the opening of the mouth ceremony, various animals were ritually killed. 2 bulls, one for the south and one for the north, gazelles, and ducks. When the bull of the south was slaughtered, one of the legs was cut off and, along with the heart, offered to the mummy. By sympathetic magic, Tutankhamun became Osiris. The sacrificial killing of the animals represented the conspirators who tried but failed to destroy the body of Osiris, and assured that the body of Tutankhamun would remain safe from such an attack. The slaughtered animals provided food for Tutankhamun's long journey. The high priest touched the mouth of the mummy with the leg of the bull, and then an assistant came forward with a ritual instrument shaped like an adze. Touching the mouth of the mummy with its implement, the priest recited, "Thy mouth was closed, but I have set in order for thee thy mouth and thy teeth. I open for thee thy mouth. I open for thee thy two eyes. I have opened thy mouth with the instrument of Anubis, with iron implement with which the mouths of the gods were opened. Horus, open the mouth. Horus, open the mouth. Horus hath opened the mouth of the dead, as he in times of old opened the mouth of Osiris with the iron, which came forth from Set. With the iron instrument with which he opened the mouths of the gods, he hath opened thy mouth with it. The deceased shall walk and speak, and his body shall be with the great company of all the gods in the great house of the aged one in Anu, and he shall receive the Eret crown from Horus, the Lord of mankind." While this ritual was being performed, Tutankhamun's body was resting inside the shrine on the sled. So a statue of Tutankhamun, one of the two life-size guardian statues, almost exactly the height of Tutankhamun, were used instead. At the conclusion of the ritual, the priest raised the adze and touched it to Tutankhamun's mouth, uttering the spell that would give the young king breath in the next world. "You are young again. You live again. You are young again. You live again, forever." Now he was ready for immortality. The pallbearers carried the body of Osiris Tutankhamun. He was now a Westerner, like Osiris, down the 13 steps leading to the tomb. At the bottom, they turned right toward the burial chamber. On their left side, they could see 3 5-foot-high ceremonial beds on which various rituals had been performed for Tutankhamun during the 70 days of mummification. At the corners of the head end of one bed were 2 beautifully carved hippopotamus heads covered in gold. The second bore the head of a cow with a sun disk between its horns. The third, lions' heads. These were the gods who controlled whether Tutankhamun would enter the next world. As the pallbearers slowly carried the mummy to the burial chamber, they took quick sideways glances, trying to take it all in, the burial treasures of a king. Waiting for them in the burial chamber was a rectangular stone sarcophagus containing 3 coffins, one inside the other like Russian dolls. Their lids lay on the floor. The pharaoh was placed inside the innermost one. While the lector priest recited prayers, unguents were poured on the body to perfume Tutankhamun's way to the next world. Then the lid of the innermost coffin was placed over Tutankhamun, sending him into darkness, the last time anyone would see his face for 35 centuries. The lid to the middle coffin was placed on its lower half, and finally the outermost coffin lid was lowered into place. Each coffin bore a likeness of the boy king. Once the final lid was in position, Akhenaten placed a miniature wreath, the Wreath of Victory, around the sculpted vulture and cobra, protecting her husband's forehead. The tiny wreath commemorated the god Osiris's victory over his enemies. As the wreath was positioned, a priest recited, "Thy father Atum binds for thee this beautiful wreath of vindication on thy brow. Live, beloved of the gods, mayest thou live forever." With that, heavy the stone lid of the sarcophagus was slid into place. The sad party of mourners walked slowly up the steps of the tomb into the blinding sunlight. As soon as the mourners left the tomb, a team of workmen hurried into the burial chamber to assemble the panels of 3 nested shrines around the sarcophagus, as an overseer watched. When their work was completed, they were replaced by masons who constructed a plaster wall sealing the burial chamber from the rest of the tomb. The statue used for the opening of the mouth ceremony and its twin were placed in front of the wall, guarding their king. The last objects for the tomb, chariots, chests of linen, ebony footstools, were quickly carried into the antechamber by servants, watched all the while, lest the pharaoh's treasures be stolen from him. Now the antechamber was sealed by the masons, the wet plaster stamped with the seal of the royal necropolis, a jackal over 9 bound captives, the 9 traditional enemies of Egypt. Even in death, Tutankhamun was victorious. Ankhesenamen's long day was not yet over. A ritual last meal in honor of Tutankhamen's victory over death had to be eaten at the entrance to the tomb. The participants wore brightly colored pectorals made of flowers and beads sewn into a papyrus collar. Normally the meal was eaten by the family of the deceased, but in this instance, Ankhesenamen, Tutankhamen's last living relative, was joined by the palace officials, Pentu, Usermant, Ai's wife, T, and General Horemheb. The servants brought a banquet of sheep, 4 different kinds of duck, 3 different kinds of geese, all washed down by considerable quantities of wine, poured from an elegant long-neck vase planted with blue lotus petals. But none present were thinking about the meal. They pondered their futures. Who could have known that 2 of the men eating together would become kings of Egypt, and, within a very short while, one of the 2 women would be dead? When the meal was completed, servants ritually broke the dishes, cups, and beautiful wine jar, and placed the fragments along with the bones of the meat and fowl inside large storage jars. Then they swept the area with brooms and placed the brooms in the jars. The jars were sealed, carried to a nearby pit that had been dug, and buried. The funeral was over. We actually have the broken dishes, collars, and brooms from the last meal. They're in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There is indeed a surgical papyrus that instructs physicians whom to treat and whom not. Painted on Tutankhamen's tomb wall are scenes of the funeral procession and the opening of the mouth ceremony. Of course, we have the treasures from Tutankhamen's tomb, but we also have x-rays of his skull. But before we can get into the evidence of his murder, we must first understand what brought him to this moment. We must understand the evolution of Egyptian society, religion, and its pharaohs. The next chapter is Egypt 101, a crash course in the history of Egypt that made the murder of a pharaoh possible. Stick with it and you'll see the forces develop that bent Egypt until it snapped. The Murder of Tutankhamun, Chapter 2, Egypt before Tutankhamun. 2,000 years before Tutankhamun was born, 3 distinct forces were set in motion that would determine the course of Egypt's social organization and which would ultimately lead to his death. Egypt would get its first king, a national military would be established, and a priesthood would develop. Over the centuries, these power bases grew strong and rich. They became so essential to Egyptian society that to change any one of them could bring disaster. Thus, for centuries and centuries, Egypt presented a seemingly static face to the ancient world. Internally, Egypt was a wealthy, well-oiled machine, with each of the 3 powers supporting the others. Tutankhamun had the unfortunate distinction of being alive when there was a dramatic, revolutionary effort to change all 3 of these simultaneously. To understand how shockingly different the times Tut grew up in were, we first have to understand how and why the country enjoyed such an unparalleled period of stability. Before we get to play detective, we have to do our history lessons. Egypt before kingship. The concept of a pharaoh in many ways defines our notion of ancient Egypt, but of course, Egypt did not always have a king. Let's look back to Egypt around 4000 BC, when the verdant Nile Valley was dotted with small villages, stretching for 1,000 miles along the Nile. We don't have written records from this period, but there seem to have been two independent political entities, Upper and Lower Egypt, each governed by its own chieftain. All indications are that life along the Nile was safe and satisfying, partly because Egypt was relatively inaccessible to the rest of the world, and thus had few marauding enemies to fear, and partly because the river provided economic bounty. Each year, the Nile overflowed its banks, depositing fresh, rich topsoil on the flat plains that spread to either side of the river, enabling Egypt to grow an abundance and variety of crops. Other countries relied on unpredictable rain that only fell during certain season in sufficient quantity to irrigate fields. Even if rainfall were spread perfectly throughout the year, fields would soon be exhausted of nutrients if they were planted more than once a year. Egypt's good fortune was to have a river that renewed the topsoil annually and flowed in sufficient volume to water the crops. Every year, Egypt harvested a variety of crops, while other countries thanked gods when they produced one. No wonder the ancient Greek traveler Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. The annual inundation amazed the Egyptians, who had no explanation for its sudden great growth, nor the fact that its color changed from red and then to green. It was a natural occurrence, of course, but it must have provided the equivalent mystery and pyrotechnics of a Las Vegas magic show. Today we know that torrential rains in Ethiopia, far south of Egypt, ran off granite bedrock to swell the Nile. The oversized Nile rushed through from sub-Saharan Africa, arriving in Egypt almost 20 feet above its normal level. It was red in color from all the runoff, soil suspended in the water, but as it overflowed and the soil settled, its color changed to the green of the floating vegetation. The annual show provided by the Nile was surpassed only by the dazzling daily performance put on by the sun. Each day it rose in the east, traveling across a cloudless, jewel-like sky, and descended into a fireball of colors in the west, constant and predictable, like the Nile. The population of the Nile Valley was probably less than 1 million. Although Egypt was a vast country, 95% of the population lived on the 5% of land that hugs the Nile. The Nile was the heart of the country. Even the seasons of the year were determined by the Nile. Our 365-day calendar comes from the Egyptians, but they counted only 3 seasons. Number 1, inundation, when the Nile overflowed and flooded the land. Number 2, emergence, when the water receded. And 3, summer, the dry season. Each season had 4 months of 30 days each. At the end of the year, 5 extra days were added to make 365 days in the year. Inundation was Egypt's most unusual season, for it was a time for relaxing. The fields were underwater and little agricultural work could be done. During these weeks, plows and implements were repaired, future crops were discussed, and plans for the future were made. Emergence was the season for planting. In summer, crops were harvested. The food staple of the farmer was bread and beer, a phrase that became synonymous with food, our meat and potatoes. A common funerary prayer begins, "May the king make an offering to Osiris, Lord of the West. May he give bread and beer, cattle, geese, and oxen, and all things good and pure upon which the gods live." The long growing season allowed the Egyptians to raise a variety of crops. the most important being emmer, or wheat, and onions. Meat was reserved for the upper classes, but the farmers had fish from the Nile, and perch was the favorite. But whatever the Egyptians ate, it was accompanied by onions. Year after year, Egypt's crops were reassuringly plentiful, and inevitably, a sense of security arose along the banks of the Nile, a feeling that nature and the world would not present any horrifying surprises. This feeling was encouraged by Egypt's geographical isolation from her neighbors. To the west of Egypt spread endless miles of desert. In order for ancient people to cross, wells had to be dug, provisions stored. In all, tremendous organization and careful planning were required. From Libya, for example, the journey to Egypt would be across more than 400 miles of arid shale. 6 centuries after Tutankhamun, when the mighty Persian king Cambyses sent an army of 20,000 men across this wilderness, they disappeared without a trace. Egypt is bordered by the Red Sea on the east, backed by 100 miles of inhospitable sand. Incidentally, the camel, the ship of the desert, did not arrive in Egypt until the Roman occupation, more than 1,000 years after Tutankhamun. To the north, hundreds of miles of the Mediterranean formed a third natural barrier, even if it was more psychological than real. Egyptians had developed their navigational skills on the smooth-flowing Nile, and they remained river sailors, not tempted by the lure and dangers of the open sea. The south offered a river-borne ingress into Egypt, for the Nile stretched far below Egypt's southern border. Since the current flows from south to north, and the prevailing winds are from north to south, travel in either direction was easy. Going north, sailors floated with the current, steering with oars. For the southward journey, they hoisted sails and followed the wind. Boat travel was easy except at Egypt's southern border, where huge river boulders created a cataract. Although it was possible to travel south past this barrier, navigation was quite difficult and laborious. The crew had to haul the boats out of the river and drag them around the boulders, or use ropes to guide them through the rapids. It was not an easy journey. In later centuries, Egyptians would wander to other lands and would bring back riches, but it was always clear to them that they were living in paradise and that it existed in this time, in this place, and nowhere else in the world. Kingship comes to Egypt. Ancient Egyptians revered their pharaoh, not simply as a leader, but as the embodiment of the country itself. Egypt's first pharaoh, Narmer, early in the 3rd millennium BC, created a nation from 2 independent states. Even after, Egyptians refer to their country as the 2 lands. Those continued unification depended entirely on the pharaoh. The Narmer palette, one of the most significant objects in all the priceless collection of Cairo's Egyptian Museum, depicts Narmer's conquest that resulted in the unification of Egypt and celebrates the importance of this achievement. Nearly 3 feet high and carved from a slab of stone, the mammoth Narmer palette introduces Egypt's first pharaoh, King Narmer. From early times, Egyptians used small plate palettes to grind ingredients for eye paints. A little bit of fat, a little pulverized malachite, and you had green eyeshadow. To commemorate important events, large ceremonial palettes were carved. On one side of the palette, King Narmer is shown wearing the traditional white crown of Upper Egypt as he strikes his enemy, presumably the ruler from the north, whom he grasps by the hair. The other side shows him walking in a procession and wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, the north. He is now king of both the north and the south, the first king of the first dynasty. This unification took place around 3200 BC, nearly 2,000 years before Tutankhamun became king of Upper and Lower Egypt. But when the boy king ascended to the throne, the concept of kingship was virtually unchanged since the time of King Narmer. Egypt would, for the next 3,000 years, be ruled by kings with absolute power, who were accepted as gods on earth and personally responsible for Egypt's well-being. Each pharaoh was a pope, president, king, and commander-in-chief, all in one. Soon after Narmer unified the northern and southern territories, the country's isolationism ended. Egypt became an aggressive international force led by the pharaoh. Egyptian armies ventured outside the borders of Egypt in search of lands to conquer and of gold to claim. Rise of the military. There are no extant military records from the first few centuries after Narmer, but the origin of Egypt's army are to be found in this period. With a centralized government under a single king, the organization of an army was inevitable. A pottery fragment inscribed with Narmer's name, found at Tel el Meshai in southern Palestine, suggests Narmer may have ventured outside of Egypt with his army. We do not know how large these armies were, but excavations have shown that their main weapons were the mace, spear, battle axe, and dagger. Warfare in the ancient world was mostly hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers were face-to-face with the enemy they killed. In today's military, generals make decisions at a distance, which are then carried out by the troops on the battlefield. In ancient warfare, the generals were in the front lines, leading by example. The military man soon became intimately acquainted with killing. Egypt could support an army because of the Nile. With the ability to grow more food than a farmer's family would consume, specialization of work developed among the Nile Valley dwellers, and so a professional standing army could be maintained. As the army grew bolder, its expeditions moved further and further from Egypt's borders. 7 centuries after Narmer, the pharaoh Snefru was able to boast that he had subdued the Bedouin tribes and made the Sinai safe for his turquoise miners. With kingship there also came a desire and ability to focus national attention on huge projects, such as irrigation canals. Digging and dredging irrigation canals required the organization of gangs of men working toward a common goal, possibly only after central organization and authority were in place. Men could be coordinated to dredge and channel, coaxing floodwaters further and further inland. This created more arable land, raising agricultural productivity even higher. Central coordination also produced, as a side effect, the beginnings of astronomy. Advance warning before the floods arrived was required to allow the time necessary to refurbish increasingly extensive canal systems. Timing was critical. Fix the old canals too soon, and the hot Egyptian sun would turn them to dust blown away by the wind. Fix them too late, and the floods would arrive before the system was finished. Fortunately, Nile inundations were quite regular, occurring within the same 5 or 10 day period each year. Needing to know when that time of year was coming before it happened prompted astronomer priests to observe the heavens and learn how to predict the time of year from the stars. One of the earliest examples of serious astronomy. Mathematics, too, had to be improved to accurately measure fields whose boundaries were washed away each year by the Nile. So fundamentally, there were pharaohs, to Egyptian society that ancient Egyptians reckon their history not as a consequence of events, but as a series of reigns of kings during which events occurred. Instead of numbering years consecutively, as ours, 1999 follows 1998, when a new king was crowned, a new calendar began with day 1, year 1 of the reign of King X. If one king died, the next king started another calendar. Day 1, year 1, King Y. This has proven a great help to modern Egyptologists in determining the length of each pharaoh's reign. But it also shows that ancient Egyptians saw no unity, even of time, without their pharaoh. In addition to placing all central authority solely on their pharaoh, they viewed him as a god necessary for their safety. The pharaoh's protection is described in one of the oldest myths in Egypt. The story tells how the god Ra once appeared on earth in human form to rule as the original pharaoh. During his reign, the country flourished as a kind of Eden without want, suffering, or disease. Ra's subjects lived such carefree lives that they gradually forgot to pay him homage and respect for the paradise he created. This angered Ra, who created a bloodthirsty demon in the form of the lioness Sekhmet, and loosed her on his errant subjects to teach them a lesson they would not soon forget. When she wantonly slaughtered hundreds of people, the frightened survivors became respectful again. But crazed by all the blood, Sekhmet continued killing, despite Ra's orders that she stop. Ra called all the gods together to agree to a scheme to save humanity. Sending some to produce vast quantities of beer and others for red dye to color it, he ordered that the mixture be spread over the ground. When Sekhmet arrived the next day to begin her round of slaying, she saw the beer and, thinking it was blood, drank until she fell, intoxicated, into a deep sleep. Thus did Ra, the pharaoh's prototype, save humanity. In time, however, Ra grew weak and returned to the netherworld, sending his son, Horus, the falcon, to rule in his place. To his subjects, Pharaoh was Horus incarnate, and each ruler took as one of his names the Horus so-and-so. Through his father Ra, Pharaoh preserved the human race, but he also had the power to destroy it. The message was understood by every subject. Only by obeying and honoring Pharaoh would unimaginable evils be kept at bay. As long as the Egyptians believed that, it would be hard to imagine anyone lifting a hand against the Pharaoh. The Age of the Pyramids. The pyramids are the ultimate testament to just how important the concept of kingship was in ancient Egypt. 500 years after Narmer's unification of Egypt, the pharaoh was stronger and more powerful than any other ruler on earth. Understood to be a living god, the pharaoh required a resting place for eternity that had to be a monument worthy of a god. When the pharaoh's days on earth were over, his mummy was placed in his pyramid till the time he would ascend to the heavens. Built more than 1,000 years before Tutankhamun, the pyramids reflected the sole kingship in Egypt, a role Tutankhamun would have to assume as a boy. As a kid, I watched Charlton Heston on television and wondered about the slaves hauling huge blocks while a cruel overseer whipped them mercilessly. I always wonder why all the slaves didn't jump the overseer. They certainly had him outnumbered. The answer is that such a scene never happened. The pyramids were built with free labor, paid for by the pharaoh. When Menachem began, the prime minister of Israel, visited Egypt, he mentioned that his ancestors built the pyramids. He had it all wrong. Not only were they not built by slaves, the pyramids were completed more than 1,000 years before Moses and the Israelites were in Egypt. The pyramids were built at the beginning of Egypt's long history. They were ancient by the time of Tutankhamun. Even as a young nation, Egypt was very sure of itself. Think about what was involved in pyramid building. There are more than 70 pyramids in Egypt, and to construct something like the Great Pyramid at Giza, thousands of laborers had to be coordinated in teams that worked for more than 20 years on one structure. Quarrymen cut and shaped 2.5 million blocks of limestone, each weighing an average of 5 tons. Transportation men floated the blocks across the Nile from the quarry to Giza. When the blocks were offloaded from the barges, they were pulled on wooden sleds by gangs of workers to their final position in the pyramid. All of this was without the use of the wheel, which would sink into the sand under heavy loads. To build the Great Pyramid, a new block was put in place an average of every 3 minutes, day and night, for 20 years. Today, it's difficult to imagine a single building project with such enormity continuing for 20 years. Only a society of great wealth and stability, led by an absolute ruler, could sustain such a project. The pharaoh's word was law, so what was said, so it was done. With a divine king and strong military, 2 of the 3 forces that would lead Tutankhamun's death were in motion. It is now time to talk about the 3rd force, religion. No other people could have been so focused on religion and have had such concern with life after death as the ancient Egyptians. This too may result from Egypt's unique geography. During the prehistoric times, Egyptians were buried in sand pits in the desert, cultivated land being too precious to use for cemeteries. This was fortunate, since the moisture and high mineral content of the soil would have destroyed cadavers. On the other hand, simple desert burials with no coffins enclosing the deceased allowed hot, dry sand to quickly dehydrate bodies. Without moisture, bacteria do not act on soft tissue, so Egypt's dead were naturally preserved. Because these graves were shallow, occasionally the wind would blow away, revealing a dead body that had retained its flesh and hair, a still recognizable individual. Whether such events gave rise to an idea of eternal life, or whether they merely reinforced an existing religious belief in life after death, we will probably never know. But what is clear is that their own eyes told the ancient Egyptians that a dead person did not vanish from existence altogether. Soon after Narmer, Egyptian burials grew more complex. Shallow pits became brick-lined tombs. Bodies were covered with animal skins and placed upon woven mats. As time passed, the brick structures became more elaborate, depending on the social status and wealth of the deceased. The woven mats were extended to cover the whole body like a crude coffin. But these early funerary practices threatened the natural preservation process. All these changes removed the bodies from the natural drying process in the hot sun. The longer body fluids are retained, the more of its soft tissue decomposes. Ironically, the tombs intended to preserve the bodies led to their destruction, forcing the Egyptians to devise means of artificially preserving the dead. Mummification. Egyptian religion required mummification. Contrary to what many modern occultists claim, the ancient Egyptians did not believe in reincarnation. The idea that a soul returns to earth after a person dies to inhabit a different body, and that this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is repeated many times. Mummification would not have been necessary had the Egyptians been reincarnationist, because the soul of the deceased could inhabit a new body. It wouldn't need the old one. The ancient Egyptians believed in resurrection, the belief that people exist just once and that their earthly bodies would reanimate, would get up and go again in the afterworld. It was a belief that would dominate Egyptian society for thousands of years and remain virtually intact for centuries after Tutankhamun. To understand the nuts and bolts of the ancient religion and the belief in life after death, you have to understand Egypt's oldest myth, the story of Isis and Osiris. Isis and Osiris were both brother and sister and husband and wife. Osiris brought civilization to Egypt, introducing farming and cattle raising, thus freeing the early inhabitants of the Nile Valley from misery. Then Osiris left Egypt to bring civilization to the rest of the world, leaving Isis, the powerful goddess of magic, to keep their evil brother Seth in check. Upon Osiris's return, Seth obtained his brother's body exact bodily measurements by trickery and constructed a wooden chest to fit him precisely. During a banquet, Seth offered the magnificent chest as a gift to whoever could fit into it. But guest after guest tried and failed. Of course it fit Osiris, but as soon as he settled inside the chest, Seth sealed the chest, poured molten lead over it, and threw the chest into the Nile, where Osiris died. A violent storm subsequently carried the chest to Byblos in Lebanon, where it washed up into the branches of a tree. In time, the tree grew to extraordinary size. Its trunk enveloped both the chest and Osiris inside it. In the course of building his palace, the king of Byblos had cut down the tree for one of the pillars. As soon as Isis learned what had happened to her husband, don't ask how, it's a very long story, she set out to recover his body. Enlisting the aid of the queen of Byblos, Isis had the pillar cut open so she could recover the body and bring it back to Egypt for proper burial. When the body was returned to Egypt, Seth discovered it, hacked it into 14 pieces, and scattered them throughout Egypt. Isis eventually recovered every piece except one, the phallus, which had been thrown into the Nile and eaten by fish. She reassembled her deceased husband, fashioned an artificial phallus for him, transforming herself into a bird. She hovered over Osiris's body and brought him back to life by reciting magical words. And shortly thereafter, their son Horus, the falcon-headed god, was born. Yes, this is the same Horus as in the Ra myth. The Egyptians didn't seem to notice or care that he had two fathers. Almost all of Egypt's funerary beliefs are derived from this myth. Isis's search for all the pieces of her deceased husband's body and the fashioning of an artificial phallus emphasized the importance of an intact body. Isis hovered over a complete body. Osiris retains the same body he had inhabited while alive. Finally, and most important, she speaks the proper words and he is resurrected. Mummification thus becomes essential to immortality. The body must be preserved for the afterlife and the proper rituals performed. The chest that exactly fit Osiris was the precursor of the anthropoid coffin, shaped like the deceased and intended to protect his body. Myths furnished insights into the nature of society, and the Isis and Osiris myth could not only tell us about immortality, but also suggest that there is justice in the world. In the story's final twist, Horus the falcon god fights an elemental battle to avenge the death of his father and defeats his uncle Seth. It is not surprising that the world's first concept of justice comes out of Egypt. To have justice, there must be a sense of order, a belief that there are rules governing behavior. This sense of order permeates every aspect of Egyptian society. The Egyptian believed that when he died, he would be called upon to appear in the Hall of the Double Truth, a court presided over by the gods of Egypt. There he would make his plea as to why he should be admitted to the next world. If found worthy, he was declared true of voice. In a second judging, his heart would be placed on one side of a balance scale, and on the other side a feather, the hieroglyphic symbol for the Egyptian word ma'at, truth, divine order. If the scales balanced and his heart was as light as a feather, uncluttered with evil deeds, he could proceed into the netherworld. If his heart was found to be heavy with evil, it was thrown to a creature with the body of a crocodile and the head of a hippopotamus, who was called the devourer of hearts. Once the creature ate your heart, you ceased to exist. When Western legal systems adopted a symbol of justice, it was the balanced scales of the Egyptians. In the myth of Osiris, Seth, who represents evil, poses a constant threat to divine order because he was not killed in the battle, he was merely defeated. So Egypt had to remain ever vigilant. Evil, emanating from Seth, was always lurking, waiting to upset Ma'at, divine order. Ultimately, it was the pharaoh's responsibility to establish and maintain divine order in the land. And once each year, the king sailed up the Nile on his royal barge and took part in a kind of mystery play that ensured that good would triumph over evil throughout the land. The play, based on the myth of Osiris, is the oldest written drama in the world. Inscribed on the walls of the Horus Temple at Edfu in the south of Egypt, it is called The Triumph of Horus. Pharaoh played the part of Horus. The Murder of Tutankhamun, Chapter 2, Part 2. The Priesthood. As Egypt grew, the pharaoh, occupied with the administration of a growing government, could no longer journey to each temple to make the necessary offerings and recite prayers pleasing to the gods, and there were plenty of them. Each town had its patron deity: Sobek, the crocodile god; Thoth, the ibis-headed god; Horus, the falcon god. Hundreds of Egyptian gods in temples up and down the Nile competed with each other for prominence in the hierarchy. Someone was needed who could stand in for the pharaoh at the shrines of the gods, who could make offerings, recite the prayers that ensured the sun a successful journey through the night. Thus, early in Egypt's history, a group of men were selected to recite the words and perform the rituals in place of the king. These were the priests of Egypt. They performed an important religious function, but the priests did not contribute to the nation's economy. The priests were a luxury and a sign of Egypt's prosperity. These substitutes for the pharaoh set the pattern of the priesthood for thousands of years. Because the priests were merely acting as representatives of the pharaoh, they were not required to hold deep religious convictions. Their duty was to perform a task, to place the proper offerings upon the altar, utter the appropriate prayers in the prescribed manner, to honor and please the god, so the god would in turn favor Egypt with prosperity. Priests were not required to be devoted to the god they served, and this was not unusual in the ancient world. In the Old Testament, there is little said about what the followers of Yahweh must believe. One had to follow the law, but none of the 10 Commandments says that you must believe. It was not until Christianity that there was an emphasis on what was in your heart. So when we think of priests, we think Egypt should not think of purely spiritual servants of the gods. These were men who could be ruthless, who were capable of evil, and in a large bureaucracy, there were plenty of opportunities. the role of high priest in a temple was usually hereditary. We have autobiographies from priests who say they held the same position as their fathers and grandfathers. Prophet of the god Min, first priest of Amun, etc. With such a huge priesthood, there were plenty of opportunities for capable and ambitious men to rise to the top. The high priest of each temple controlled the temple's fields, orchards, and cattle. It was an administrative position that led to great personal wealth and power. Along with the position of high priest came estates, servants, gifts, bribes, and all the trappings of nobility. Beneath the high priest were the second and third prophets of the god, and beneath them were endless ranks of castes of priests, a hierarchy that would rival any modern corporation. The different branches of the priesthood were fiercely competitive, each claiming priority for their god, seeking the pharaoh's special patronage and the rewards that it would bring. At Memphis, near modern Cairo, the patron god Ptah, who created the universe, was proclaimed to be the foremost of all the gods. But every city claimed its patron deity was the foremost. Thrusting your patron god to the forefront didn't just earn you theological brownie points, it was a struggle for wealth and status, something the priests of ancient Egypt knew very well. One could succeed in the priesthood by merit, and often scribes rose through the ranks to high office. Each temple had its own hierarchy of priests, each group performing specific duties, each holding special privileges. The temple scribes kept careful records of the gifts bestowed on the temple by the pharaoh, and they recorded the yield of the temple's lands, inventoried the storerooms, the grain, wine, linen, and gold. They copied sacred prayers on papyrus scrolls, so the lector priest who read the prayers would have clear copies. Other scribes were temple librarians, organizing the papyrus scrolls so they could be easily located and consulted. Besides the religious texts, the temples kept medical texts for the priest-physicians and books of dream interpretation to be consulted by those who wanted to know what their dreams meant. The stolist were priests who attended the statues of the gods. They followed a precise routine of devotion to maintain the gods' continuing goodwill. Each day at the prescribed time, the stolist priest entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost sacred room in the temple, withdrew the statue of the god from its shrine, and performed the morning rituals. The god was anointed with fragrant oil, placated with incense, presented with the choicest foods, then wrapped in pure white linen and replaced in the holy shrine. As the doors were closed and bolted, prayers and incantations were chanted. Many of the priests holding lesser positions were married, had families, and held jobs outside the temple. They were carpenters, teachers, and scribes who would, at regular intervals, serve 30 days in the temple, a kind of religious national guard, and then return to secular life. When pharaohs conquered foreign lands and returned with gold and captives, they donated a portion of the tributes to the temple to thank the gods for looking upon them with favor in battle, and to ensure their continued goodwill. Foreign captives became a sizable source of manpower in maintaining the temples, as well as the fields or orchards owned by the temples. Pharaohs often gave large tracts of land to the temples so the cattle and produce could provide a continuing annuity. As each succeeding pharaoh tried to surpass his predecessor's generosity, temples grew incredibly wealthy, and the priests numbered in the tens of thousands. In the years just before the birth of Tutankhamun, the priesthood of Egypt had swollen to the largest bureaucracy the world had ever known, a powerful force second only to the pharaoh. It is interesting that although pharaohs conquered foreign lands, Egypt never became a true empire. The gods of Egypt were the gods of only Egypt. The pharaoh was king of Upper and Lower Egypt, not of the world. Life on the banks of the Nile was too good to want to live somewhere else, to colonize and live in foreign lands. If you died on foreign soil, far from the Egyptian embalmers, your body might not be mummified, and all chance of immortality would be lost. Better to live in Egypt. So when the pharaoh rode out with the army each year to conquer his neighbors, the troops always returned home to Egypt. For the Egyptians, the center of the universe was Egypt, and at the center of Egypt was the pharaoh. Much of our understanding of ancient Egypt comes from the ancient Egyptians' belief in life after death. Because they believed you could literally take it with you, tombs were filled with furniture, food, clothes, even games to amuse themselves in the next world. There were items of luxury, practicality, and whimsy. It was as if they were packing for a trip to a place they'd never visited and weren't sure what to bring, so they brought everything. Tombs are windows into daily life in ancient Egypt. Their contents weren't carefully arranged like many apartments. Objects were piled on top of each other and crammed into every small space. On top of a bed might be the toiletry objects of the lady of the house, her favorite scents and oils, still in delicate alabaster jars, her eye paint in slender ceramic tubes. Next to this might be stacks of fine linens, clothing, and food, breads, and sweets of all kinds, and wine jars of a favorite vintage sealed for eternity, joints of meat, roast duck. It was the ultimate picnic. This is how we know what the Egyptians ate and drank at banquets, what they wore, and what kind of furniture they had. Sometimes the scenes painted on the tomb walls are just as revealing. Every ancient Egyptian wanted immortality, and the chance at attaining it was directly tied to his wealth and status. The kind of tomb you prepared for your afterlife depended on what you could afford. The beautifully painted tombs that we see in art books were prepared for Egypt's aristocracy. The nobility invested as much as they could afford in their tombs, and sometimes, as a special favor, the pharaoh would grant a member of the court a prime location. For most Egyptians, the farmers, the craftsmen, and the laborers, there were no beautiful tombs packed with furniture, food, and luxuries. When his time came, the common man was wrapped in a sheet, perhaps from his own bed, and placed in a mass burial site for the poor. There, surrounded by hundreds of his deceased neighbors, he awaited resurrection. Since most commoners couldn't write, they left no literature, no records of their hopes and concerns, no stories of their lives. Most of what we know about ancient Egypt comes from the privileged few. The idea of decorating tomb walls with scenes from daily life was based on a principle of ancient Egyptian magic. If you showed it, it would happen in the next world. Egyptian tomb walls are covered with scenes of the deceased fishing, feasting, hunting, overseeing the work in his field on his estate. The whole family was almost always portrayed, the wife, kids, and pets, so the deceased would have company in the next world. When I look at the paintings in an Egyptian tomb, I get the feeling they thought the next world was just like this one, only better, maybe with air conditioning. You never see an unhappy camper on a tomb wall. They may be working in the fields, but they're wearing their finest linen robes. Sometimes a high official would write his autobiography on his tomb wall, chronicling his accomplishments. Military men often gave vivid accounts of their campaigns, royal scribes related their duties in the palace, and governors listed the territories under their jurisdiction and the taxes collected for the king. Sometimes the vizier, the equivalent of prime minister, listed his official responsibilities. Each tomb was a miniature world revealing the life of the deceased. Preserved by Egypt's dry climate, the tombs form a three-dimensional encyclopedia of ancient Egypt. As the custodians of writing, priests were often the keepers of records, an essential part of any bureaucracy. And as Egypt grew, so did the number and importance of the record keepers. Because the fertile land along the Nile produced a surplus of crops, the pharaoh collected the excess, the origin of taxes, to pay the army and the priest. When taxes were collected up and down the Nile, accountants were needed to tally the crops grown by each farmer to record how much was deposited in the pharaoh's granaries. Egypt's booming economy produced an army of bureaucrats, and becoming a scribe was a sure path to upward mobility. Ancient texts urged the youth of Egypt to learn how to write. You won't have to march in the army, your robes will be clean, you won't have to work the field in the heat of the day. Once you could write, you were on your way up. There were all kinds of scribes. Some spent their days listing inventories in temple storerooms and had titles like Scribe of Amen. Others wrote religious text and were called Keepers of the Secrets. If you showed ability, you might become a royal scribe, attached to the palace, perhaps answering correspondence or composing inscriptions to be carved on the temple walls. As Egypt became prosperous, the country was divided into administrative units called nomes, almost the exact equivalent of our states. There were 44 nomes, each with a nomarch or governor, and under him were other officials, the mayors of the towns, overseers of construction, overseers of the scribes, overseer of the stables. All of these officials were selected from the ranks of the scribes. No wonder parents were always urging their children to be a scribe. This was the middle class. There were books that told you how to move quickly up the ranks. Don't indulge in drinking beer, lest you utter evil speech. Study the writings, put them in your heart, then your words will be effective. Attend to your position, be it high or low. It is not good to press forward. Step according to rank. It was practically a Dale Carnegie course for ancient Egyptians. What made the whole thing possible was the growing population of farmers. There were no hungry mouths. Each new arrival could be fed, and still there was a surplus. Luxury industries could be supported. Artists were hired to decorate tomb walls. Jewelers and craftsmen were paid for their creations, and it was all the gift of the Nile. By the time Tutankhamun came to power, the three major forces of Egyptian society, kingship, the military, and religion, had been in place for centuries and were growing stronger, more demanding, and independent. The pharaoh could not maintain divine order without the priesthood and the military. The priests were eager for donations from the pharaoh and for booty from the military. The military, strong in their own right, still asked for the gods' favor for successful campaigns, and it was politic to have the support of the priest. It was a delicate balance among them, for each of the three institutions had grown so strong that it was almost unstoppable. But the notion of divine kingship remained central to it all, and Egypt without a pharaoh was unthinkable. Kingship was the foundation of civilization throughout the ancient world. Every great nation had a leader, without whom there would be chaos. But Egypt alone perceived its king as divine. The pharaoh was the son of God, Ra, the sun god. Other nations were led by mere mortals. In Egypt, a god was at the helm. Of the 170 or so kings whose reigns were recorded, most followed and upheld the traditional role of kingship. They led the army, built monuments, and made offerings to the gods. Under the pharaoh's guidance, divine order prevailed and Egypt prospered, but the line of succession from Narmer to Tutankhamun was not without its breaks. There is a tendency to think of Egyptian history as perfectly seamless, but there were times when the fabric of Egypt tore. The point to be made is that when such rare events occurred, the society was so well established that it could right itself again. There may have been brief periods of chaos, but the infrastructure was still there. The land was still produced, the priests still had wealth, the concept of kingship was unchanging, and the military was in the wings. For example, the pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom, but by 2200 BC, Egypt had descended into anarchy, and the era of pyramid building was over. We're not sure why Egyptian society collapsed. There are a few records. One theory is that the last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom lived too long. Pepi II became pharaoh as a child and reigned for more than 90 years, the longest reigning monarch in the history of the world. Unlike modern England, where the monarch is a figurehead, Egypt's pharaoh actually led the army into battle. As Pepi grew older and older, perhaps he was unable to govern. The army was not maintained, and Egypt grew weak. Egypt was tumbled by its greatest strength, a strong central government built around its king as absolute ruler. If the pharaoh was weak, Egypt suffered. Tutankhamun would learn this lesson firsthand. For more than a century after Pepi, Egypt was without a true king as local governors fought for supremacy. Even in this period of weakness, Egypt was not invaded. Its natural barriers of sand and water held. Finally, a local ruler, like King Narmer, unified the land, and Egypt had its pharaoh. Like a boat righting itself after capsizing, Egypt had returned to exactly the same position that had served it so well. With a single absolute ruler leading a strong military and priesthood, divine order had returned to the land. But we are still 800 years away from Tutankhamun's reign, and we have talked only in terms of political forces, kingship, and the priesthood. It would be an oversimplification to view Egypt as only a vast mechanical system, totally determined by the laws of physics. It was also the personalities that made Egypt great. It is time to meet Tutankhamun's family. The Murder of Tutankhamun, Chapter 3. Tutankhamun's Ancestors, the Glorious 18th Dynasty. Egypt believed its rightful place in the world order was on top, dominating her neighbors. The history of Egypt can be viewed, in fact, as a series of conquest. It was the natural order of things. To maintain supremacy, the pharaoh repeatedly led the army out of Egypt, smashed some foreign country, then returned home with anything of value that wasn't nailed down. The subdued country was expected to send annual tribute, or the pharaoh would return. Today we would view this as unprovoked aggression, which it was, but it was also the way of life in the ancient world. No pharaoh ever boasted, "There were no battles in my reign." Annual invasions were necessary because the Egyptians never colonized. Once they conquered a foreign territory, that was it. They went home and waited for the yearly tribute. But with the army far away in Egypt, there wasn't much incentive for foreign countries to send tribute. So the pharaoh would ride out with his army again, repeating the cycle. War was the natural order of things in Egypt. Thutmose I, one of the early pharaohs in Tutankhamen's dynasty, is best known for his military exploits, but he is also significant because he is the reason that the pharaohs of the New Kingdom are buried in the Valley of the Kings and not in pyramids. An autobiographical inscription in the tomb of Thutmosis' overseer of the works, Eneni, describes how the first tomb was constructed. I inspected the excavation of the cliff tomb of His Majesty, alone, no one seeing, no one hearing. It was a work of my heart. My virtue was wisdom. There was not given to me a command by an elder. I shall be praised because of my wisdom after years, by those who shall imitate that which I have done. Secrecy was indeed crucial if Thutmoses' body was to be protected. Soon after the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the pyramids of Giza were plundered by tomb robbers, and all the bodies destroyed. When the government finally stabilized, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom resumed pyramid building. But a diminished workforce and reduced resources resulted in interiors being constructed of mud brick with only a thin stone casing skimming their exterior surfaces. These pyramids were also plundered, so Thutmoses' secret tomb, carved into the cliff of a desolate valley, was meant to outsmart tomb robbers. 8 generations later, Tutankhamun would join his august ancestor in this place that became known as the Valley of the Kings. Those generations included some of the greatest monarchs ever to rule Egypt. Tutankhamun's ancestors, the kings of the 18th Dynasty, elevated the concept of the warrior pharaoh to heights never before seen. The pharaoh Thutmoses created an army of thousands of well-trained, well-equipped career soldiers. It was totally unlike the small corps Narmer had organized, and it had an advantage that Narmer couldn't have imagined: the chariot. 2 horses pulled these chariots that carried 2 men, a driver and an archer. Chariots were constructed from imported wood, elm wheels for its suppleness, and ash for the body because of its strength. The floor was woven from leather thongs and covered with a leather flap, acting as a shock absorber, providing a relatively stable platform from which the archer could shoot his arrows. It was a light body with a lot of engine. Supporting the charioteers were the infantry. Each soldier carried a leather shield, spear, battle axe, and dagger. The infantry marched 15 miles a day. By the time Thutmoses was through with his campaigns, Egypt was master of 700 miles between Egypt and the Euphrates River. On the banks of the Euphrates, Thutmoses erected a stela, a large round-top stone, resembling a giant tombstone, that served as an ancient Egyptian bulletin board. If you wanted to announce something, you carved it on a stela, and Thutmoses proclaimed that this was Egypt's northern territory. The only surviving child of Thutmoses and his queen was Princess Hatshepsut. There is no word for queen in ancient Egyptian. The phrase we translate as queen is actually king's great wife. Had Hatshepsut been a son, the royal crown would have passed directly to him. But she was a girl, and this created a problem. It is not always clear how the successor to the throne was chosen. It wasn't as simple as in England, where the laws of prima blah 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 decreed that the throne was passed down through the king's eldest son, which specified contingencies for all possibilities. In Egypt, the pharaoh had several wives and could also marry his sisters, so the lines of succession for his children could be rather complex. Overall, the rule known as the heiress theory covered most cases. Whoever married the eldest, most royal daughter became pharaoh. When Thutmoses died, his son Thutmoses II, by a minor wife, was married to his half-sister Hatshepsut, the eldest daughter of the pharaoh and his great wife. Marriage to Hatshepsut established Thutmoses II's right to the throne. The couple had a successful, uneventful 20-year reign. When Thutmoses II died, he left 2 children. a daughter by Hatshepsut, and a young son, Thutmose III, by a minor wife. Hatshepsut ruled as regent for the young boy for about 7 years. Then, suddenly, one of the most incredible events in Egypt's long history occurred. Hatshepsut changed her royal title from queen to king, and had herself portrayed in full male royal regalia, complete with a beard. This was unheard of in conservative ancient Egypt. By wearing the false beard and the royal kilt of the pharaoh, Hatshepsut was attempting to stay within the traditional boundaries of Egyptian kingship. She was the king who happened to be a woman. The only reason Hatshepsut pulled it off was that she was a good administrator, and her reign brought prosperity throughout the land. That she chose to be represented as king posed several challenges for the artists and scribes in Hatshepsut's court. Was the pharaoh to be referred to as His Majesty or Her Majesty? They did it both ways. When Hatshepsut died on the 10th day of the 6th month in the 22nd year of her reign, February 1482 BC, Thutmose III became sole ruler of Egypt, and through his conquest went on to become the greatest military leader Egypt had ever seen. In the 16 years following Hatshepsut's death, Thutmose III led 14 military campaigns north of Egypt, causing Egyptologists to dub him the Napoleon of Egypt. In year 33 of his reign, Thutmose battled his way to the Euphrates River, defeated the king of Mitanni, and erected his own stela alongside his grandfather's, and another one across the river. A generation after her death, Thutmose had Hatshepsut's name erased from all her monuments in an official attempt to remove any trace of her from the records of Egypt. It was too revolutionary to admit that a king of Egypt had been a woman. This erasure of a pharaoh's name and memory established an ominous precedent. 100 years later, a similar purge would sweep through Egypt. This time, Tutankhamun would be the target. When Thutmose III died after 54 years as king, Egypt was the military power feared by all in the Middle East. He was Tutankhamun's great-great-great-grandfather. The remaining pharaohs between Thutmose III and Tutankhamun maintained the great tradition of their ancestors. They elevated the 18th Dynasty above all previous and subsequent eras of Egypt's glorious history. Now, Tutankhamun's direct ancestors began to emerge. 25 years before his birth, Egypt was ruled by his strong-willed, decisive grandfather, Amenhotep III, or Amenhotep III, a man whose probity and strength would echo loudly through the lives of succeeding pharaohs. Secure in his claim to the throne because his father had publicly nominated him as his successor, Amenhotep was able to marry a commoner. His wife did not have to be of pure royal blood to establish his right to rule. To commemorate his marriage to the Lady T, he sent his ancient Egyptian equivalent of a telegram, a carved stone in the shape of a scarab beetle, a symbol of good luck. On the base of the scarab was the inscription, "The king's great wife T, may she live. The name of her father is Yuya. The name of her mother is Toya. She is the wife of a mighty king." Anyone reading between the lines would get the message. T is a commoner, but you had better accept her as my wife. All indications are that it was a successful marriage. Statues of the king show T next to him, represented in almost equal size, a great honor to his queen. Royalty was always shown as idealized, but T's portraits often convey a sense of the person. The beautifully sculpted head of Queen T in the Berlin Museum is that of a mature woman with handsome, regular features, a strong woman who got whatever she wanted. Ti bore the king 6 children, 4 daughters and 2 sons. The princesses were given important titles. One daughter, Sit-Amen, was called the king's wife, which suggests to some Egyptologists that she was married to her father. Often, sisters married their own half-brothers, but it was rare for a pharaoh to marry his own daughters. The oldest son, named Thutmose, after his ancestor, was groomed for the throne by being given the important position of High Priest of Memphis, one of the 2 capitals of Egypt, along with Thebes. This was a shrewd maneuver on the part of Amenhotep III. It was always politic to honor the gods of Egypt, and he now had a loyal family member inside the powerful priesthood. The younger son, Amenhotep, was named for his father, but he was mentioned in no royal inscriptions, is not shown in any statues, and his name appears only on one broken wine jar. Such were the inauspicious beginnings of Tutankhamun's father, a prince who appeared to have no future. We will look closely at this enigmatic figure in the next chapter. The reign of Amenhotep III was as close as Egypt, or almost any other country, got to paradise. Never did precious unguents and oils flow so freely. Turquoise, lapis lazuli, and gold adorn more necklaces, or rich, aromatic cedar form more temple doors. Food was abundant and there was peace. Thanks to Amenhotep's predecessors, Egypt now firmly controlled the area from northern Syria to the 5th cataract of the Nile, the center of the Sudan. The military rarely had to demonstrate its might by fighting, so firmly had all the earlier invasions driven the lesson home. A steady flow of gold from Nubia, Sudan, and the western desert kept Egypt's economy strong, promoting a foreign king corresponding with Amenhotep III to observe, "Gold is like dust in your country. One has only to pick it up." From Kush in the south came elephant tusks, giraffe skins, and ebony wood for palace furniture. From Afghanistan came lapis lazuli to be carved into amulets of the gods and used as inlays in jewelry. By now, foreign traders were regularly plying the Mediterranean. From Crete came exotic jars for palace use. Cyprus contributed copper ingots. Amenhotep had favored the gods, and the gods had favored Egypt. It was good business all around. Amenhotep and Queen Ti led a cosmopolitan life, successfully integrating both halves of the country. They traveled frequently between Memphis and Thebes. Memphis, the northern capital, was situated where the Nile began to branch out into the delta fan on its way to the Mediterranean. It was the administrative center of Egypt, where the king resided to control the country. It held the national archives and accommodated thousands of bureaucrats. Little remains of Memphis today because of a rising water table at the site. A colossal statue here, a massive column there, evoke what must have been the busiest city in the world. Sadly, the office complexes that compose the city were constructed of sun-dried bricks. The time and rising water have returned to the mud from which they came. The palace suffered the same fate. All the precious documents from the archives disintegrated and rotted away. The fate of wet papyrus. Glorious temples have sunk out of sight into the moist ground. The 400-mile journey from Memphis south to Thebes took the royal barge about 3 weeks, sailing against the current. The boat was a huge, lumbering craft about 200 feet long, built for comfort on river voyages. Along the way, Amenhotep stopped to perform rituals in the temples, events that would be remembered by generations of priests who would fondly recall their brush with a living god. If Memphis was like Washington, filled with records and preoccupied with business, then Thebes was like Paris, wealthy, glamorous, and alluring. Thebes was a city of edifices, built for the glory of the gods, not of functional office buildings. With every military conquest, Amenhotep's ancestors had heaped large portions of their plunder on Thebes' temples in gratitude for their success. Coffers overflowed with gold, storehouses burst with endless bolts of white linen, the priestly cloth, and produce arrived in endless streams from thousands of acres of donated farmland. The priests were rich and on their way to becoming independent. Their land produced wheat, cattle, vegetable, everything they needed, plus a surplus that could be sold. So when the royal barge finally docked at Thebes, Amenhotep and Ti would have been met by a thriving, prosperous priesthood. Homer called the city 100-gated Thebes because of the countless huge pylons that formed the entrances to temple upon temple. And indeed, Thebes had temples to many gods, but the reason for the city's importance was the patron deity Amun, the hidden one. To this god, Egyptians attributed the resurrection of their country from the anarchy and foreign domination that followed the Old Kingdom. By Amenhotep's time, almost 1,000 years of pharaohs had taken Amun as their special patron and pledged donations for his support, making Thebes more splendid with every gift. Amun had eclipsed even the old god Ra, incorporating that former preeminent god in one of his titles, Amun-Ra. Represented as a man with a tall crown surmounted by 2 ostrich plumes, Amun was married to the goddess Mut. With their son Khonsu, they formed the Trinity, the Holy Family of Thebes. Amenhotep's own name meant Amun is pleased. He proceeded to outdo every other pharaoh in ensuring that God's continued satisfaction. Perhaps urged on by priests, Tutankhamun's grandfather embarked on the most massive building ever to honor the patron god of Thebes and himself. He seems also to have had genuine beliefs of his own. After all, he named his oldest son Thutmose. Thoth is born in honor of Thoth, the god of writing. His second son was named for Amun, as was Amenhotep himself, and his eldest daughter was named for that god as well. The pharaoh began his homage to Amun at the great temple of Karnak, the largest religious structure ever built. It was not really a single cathedral, but a complex of temples and shrines sprawling across acres of land in no particular order. Like Topsy, it just grew as over the centuries each pharaoh dedicated his particular monument to the gods. When Amenhotep began his addition to the great temple of Karnak, the pylons of Thutmose I and his daughter Hatshepsut were still standing. People still marveled at Thutmose's obelisk, the first to be erected in Karnak Temple. First, Amenhotep constructed a pair of grand entrance pylons, the third pylon, in front of the other buildings at Karnak, so that these largest, most magnificent gates would be the first anyone would see. Their cornices were brightly painted and festooned with colorful pennants that flew from 60 feet high. Shining electrum, a gold-silver alloy, covered poles. The imposing structure was dedicated to Amun. 1.5 miles from Karnak, in central Thebes, stood another temple of great importance. Once each year, shaven-head priests bore the weighty gold statue of Amun to a special divine bark, while others carried the statue of his wife Mut to her ship to form a convoy that sailed to this temple. Priests in their finest white robes joined important dignitaries adorned in silver and gold to trail the vessels in a procession called the Beautiful Festival of the Harem, the most festive, most important holiday of Thebes. The celebration recreated the wedding of the two gods and of the conjugal bliss that followed. It took place in the Harem of the South, a smallish temple used just once a year. Amenhotep directed his architects to replace the old temple with a beautifully proportioned, more imposing substitute. They produced a colonnade hall of 7 pairs of majestic lotus columns leading into an open court. 2 sides of the court were flanked with a double row of papyrus bud columns roofed by slabs of stone, creating a shady spot beside an open yard prefaced by a forest of columns. Past the court, at the far end of the temple, a double sanctuary was constructed, the Holy of Holies, that housed the gold statues of Amun and Mut. Amenhotep had outdone himself in this tribute to the great god. It was the largest temple ever built by a single pharaoh. Amenhotep took such interest in these projects that he built a palace across the river, where open land was still available, so he could reside in comfort near enough to oversee the construction. Only a few walls of this place have survived, since each building was intended for the lifetime of just one pharaoh, and were constructed of impermanent mud bricks. Enough remains, however, to show it was a splendid affair. Floors were brightly painted with scenes from nature, walls with colorful, decorative borders. Rather than a single large building, it was a compound with a separate building for the king and his staff, another for the queen and her court, another to serve as the kitchen, and still others to house the palace guard. In addition, there was a large auditorium or festival hall in which Amenhotep celebrated special jubilees, celebrating his long rule. It seems that, despite proximity to the Nile, Amenhotep constructed an artificial lake behind the palace large enough for Queen T to sail her barge. As time passed, Amenhotep's personality mingled more and more with the glory of the city. He ordered a pair of the largest statues ever carved of himself, seated in 70 feet high majesty, to lead the way to a new temple dedicated to his memory. Nothing of this temple survives today, but the massive seated statues of Amenhotep still gaze eternally towards Thebes. These are the famed colossi of Memnon that amazed visitors in antiquity. The unparalleled building spree of Amenhotep must have energized the city to an unprecedented frenzy. He provided steady work for thousands of workers, quarrying, cutting, dressing, and transporting tons of stone. Hundreds of artists carved and painted scenes on gleaming new temples and the luxurious palace. Riches flowed into Thebes as never before. A magic grew about Thebes that captured the hearts of poets. She is called the city, says a late New Kingdom hymn in her praise. All others are under her shadow, to magnify themselves through her. Soon the banks of the Nile were dominated by magnificent architecture, representing a rich facade that hid a less than perfect interior. The houses and shops of the mortals sprawled in confusion behind the temples, forming a maze of dirty, narrow, winding streets. It was a noisy city filled with the sounds of horses, penned ducks, pigs, and people busy at their work at surviving. Although they resided in the greatest city in Egypt, life remained hard for the common people. Clouds of dust hung over their houses from the continuous cutting and polishing of stone for all the construction. Overpoweringly pungent odor emanated from all the animals in crowded conditions, and flies, lice, and fleas were ever present. Despite its face of splendor and energy, or maybe because of it, Thebes began to question itself. Many in the upper class believed that the priesthood of Amun had become too rich, too materialistic, and too powerful. Although the king and the nobles of the city continued to pay tribute to Amun, as time passed, some of the faithful added an interest in other cults. Amenhotep led the way when he took the new title, dazzling sun disk of all the land. It became popular at the court to contemplate the nature of the sun disk, the Aten, an interest not confined to the king alone, for Queen T named her pleasure boat the Aten Gleams. People in the highest places were thinking about religion now, instead of merely going through the old motions. This profoundly affected the mind of Amenhotep's ignored second son, who would ascend the throne before long. For his final resting place, Amenhotep selected an isolated wadi west of the Valley of the Kings that had never been used before. Why he chose not to be buried near his august ancestors of the 18th Dynasty, we will never know. Amenhotep III had a mind of his own. Then, tragedy struck the elderly king and his wife. Their eldest son, Thutmose, the high priest of Ptah, died. This was the son groomed to succeed his father. Their grief must have been intense, compounded by the fact that all of Amenhotep's plans for the future, for Egypt after his passing, died with his boy. Now there was the real question of who would succeed the pharaoh. There was the second son, named Amenhotep for his father, but there probably was a reason he had been so rarely mentioned. He may have been afflicted with some very strange disease. No doubt there were other contenders for the throne, perhaps sons by Pharaoh's minor wives, some of whom were princesses of foreign countries. But only one was T's child. She must have schemed successfully in his behalf, because with all his problems, he became the heir and more. In what seemed a surprising move, the aging king appointed his younger son, Amenhotep, to be co-regent, which meant that they would rule together. There would be no controversy as to who ruled Egypt when the king died. The question is, why did Amenhotep III, the energetic and powerful ruler, agree to share his power? The answer can perhaps be found in Amenhotep III's mummy, which was discovered in 1898 under strange circumstances by a very nervous Egyptologist. Victor Loret, a Frenchman, served for a short time as head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. High-strung and unsuited for his high administrative position, Loret managed to antagonize both European and Egyptian authorities, and consequently lasted only 2 years. He had barely time to undertake the first systematic excavation in the Valley of the Kings, discovering the robbed tombs of Thutmose I and Thutmose III, Egypt's Napoleon. He also found the tomb of Amenhotep II, in which lied the answer to our question. This, too, was a plundered tomb. Broken bits of blue ceramic and wooden funerary objects with Amenhotep II's name littered the entrance passage when Loret uncovered it. Crawling through the passageway, Loret came to a square shaft, or well, designed to catch water so that the burial chamber would remain dry during the rare cloudbursts that occurred in the Valley of the Kings. Placing a ladder across the well, Loret crossed into a square, pillared antechamber and saw broken funerary boats and models of what the pharaoh would need in the next world. Gilded images of the king and broken Ushabti servant statues that were supposed to come to life in the next world and perform any task needed. It was now late into the night. Loret was tired, and with only his candle to illuminate the scene, his imagination started to take over. Then the candlelight fell on something for which he was not prepared. I went forward between two columns, and with my candle, and horrible sight. A body lay there upon the boat, all black and hideous, its grimacing face turned towards me and looking at me, its long brown hair in sparse bunches around its head. I did not dream for an instant that this was an unwrapped mummy. The legs and arms seemed to be bound. A hole exposing the sternum. There was an opening in the skull. Was this a victim of human sacrifice? Was this a thief, murdered by his accomplices in a bloody division of the loot, or perhaps killed by soldiers, or police interrupting the pillaging of the tomb? What Loret had seen was the mummy of a prince, disturbed so soon after his burial that the oils and resins used in embalming were still liquid. The robbers had placed the body in one of the molded boats, where the oils solidified and glued the mummy to it. Regaining his composure, Loret continued his descent, eventually arriving at a burial chamber containing a lidless stone sarcophagus. Peering over the top, Loret saw a coffin with a garland of flowers at its head and a wreath at its foot. He had found the mummy of Amenhotep II. Loret's long evening was not over. Examining the 4 side chambers off the burial chambers, he found statues of the pharaoh, vases for the 7 sacred oils the king would need, meats and fruits to sustain him in the next world, and wooden models of boats for his journey to the netherworld. It was in one of these side chambers that Loret received his next shock. We passed to the rooms on the right. In the first one we entered, an unusually strange sight met our eyes. 3 bodies lay side by side at the back in the left corner, their feet pointing toward the door. The right half of the room was filled with little coffins with mummiform covers and funerary statues of bitumen, resin-painted wood. These statues were contained in the coffins that the thieves had opened and rejected after having searched in vain for treasures. We approached the cadavers. The first seemed to be that of a woman. A thick veil covered her forehead and left eye. Her broken arm had been replaced at her side, her hands in the air. Ragged and torn cloth hardly covered her body. Abundant black curled hair spread over the limestone floor on each side of her head. The face was admirably conserved and had a noble and majestic gravity. The second mummy in the middle was that of a child of about 15. He was naked with the hands joined on the abdomen. First of all, the head appeared totally bald, but on closer examination, one saw that the head had been shaved, except an area on the right temple, from which grew a magnificent tress of black hair. This was the coif of the royal princes, called the Horus lock. I thought immediately of the royal prince Weben Sennu, this so far unknown son of Amenephis II, whose funerary statue I had noticed in the great hall, and whose canopic fragments I was to later find. The face of the young prince was laughing and mischievous. It did not at all evoke the idea of death. The last corpse, nearest the wall, seemed to be that of a man. His head was shaved, but a wig lay on the ground not far from him. The face of this person displayed something horrible and something droll at the same time. The mouth was running obliquely from one side nearly to the middle of the cheek, with a pad of linen whose 2 ends hung from the corner of the lips. The half-closed eyes had a strange expression. He could have died choking on a gag, but he looked like a playful young cat with a piece of cloth. Death, which had respected the severe beauty of the woman and the impish grace of the boy, had turned in derision and amused itself with the countenance of the man. These 3 corpses, like the one in the boat, had their skulls pierced with a large hole, and the breast of each one was opened. The condition of the 3 mummies inside the chamber and the one in the boat was caused by methodical tomb robbers. In their search for jewelry, they hacked at the wrappings on the heads first, quickly stripping the outer linen. Then they hacked at the chest, searching for more jewelry, damaging the royal bodies. Loret had no idea of the identities of the 4 mummies, and his judgment was certainly confused that night. The 3rd mummy in the side chamber that he described as a man is clearly that of a young woman. To this day, the identities of most of these bodies remain uncertain. One identification was made almost a century later and required both modern technology and a find in Tutankhamun's tomb, but more about that later. The 4 mummies that so moved Leray were not the only ones he found that night. One of the side chambers had been sealed with limestone blocks, with only a small opening near the ceiling. Leray climbed to the top and with his flickering candle was barely able to make out 9 coffins, neatly arranged, 6 against the wall and 3 in front of them. That was all he could see, and he realized that the wall would have to be taken down before the coffins could be studied. But first the tomb had to be cleared. Leray mapped the tomb, superimposing a grid to record the position of more than 2,000 objects. Only after this was he finally able to examine the 9 coffins behind the wall. Leray had discovered the mummies of 8 kings of Egypt and an unidentified woman. These mummies had been rescued from their plundered tombs by a 21st century dynasty king in order to protect them from further desecration. Written on the bandages of the mummy of Seti II was a sad story of how the convention of kings came to be held in the tomb of Amenhotep II. On the 6th day of the 4th month of winter in the 12th year of the reign of Pinigem I, the king had collected despoiled royal bodies, rewrapped them, and placed them in the tomb of Amenhotep II for safekeeping, where they remained until Leray's discovery. Among the mummies were Tutankhamun's grandfather, Amenhotep III. The mummy of Amenhotep III, along with the others, were taken by boat to Cairo, where it remained till it was unwrapped on September 23, 1905. The mummy of the father provided the clue as to why his son, Amenhotep IV, became co-pharaoh with his father. The king was fat and in very poor health when he died. When I examined the mummy in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, it was clear that Amenhotep must have been in great pain towards the end of his life. He suffered from horrible abscesses on his lower right incisors and his upper right canine. I could tell he had lost the incisors some time before death, as the sockets had filled in with new bone growth. Dental disease was common in ancient Egypt for king and commoners alike. Not from eating too much sugar, as it is today, but from their daily bread. All grains in ancient Egypt were stone ground, which meant that along with your bread, you ate a considerable portion of sand and grit. Years of eating Egyptian bread wore down the teeth, exposing them to decay. Skilled as the Egyptian physicians were, they did not practice dentistry. With the severe deterioration of his teeth, Amenhotep III must have been in constant pain. He may have been sedated with wine or even the new wonder drug of the 18th century imported from Cyprus, opium. Cypriot physicians collected the sap that oozed from slits in the poppy's capsule, then dried the sticky mass for easy application. Applied directly to a wound or tooth, it may have had about the same effect as a modern-day injection. Amenhotep would have found it difficult to carry out the affairs of state as his health deteriorated, and may have been so sedated that he was in no condition to make decisions. Under these circumstances, it would have been easy for the determined Queen T to convince her husband to share the duties so difficult for him in his pained state with their son, Amenhotep IV. As co-regent, her son was assured the throne when the old king died. When the young king finally came to power after his father's death, one of the first changes he seemed to have made was to improve a new technique for the mummification of his father. The embalmers injected tree resin and salts under the skin of the arms, legs, and neck to fill them out and to give the body a more lifelike appearance. It was a small break with tradition, but one that foretold dramatic changes to come.